Hello, thank you for following my session on writing tips for thesis. And this time we'll focus on chapter 5, which is the last chapter of the thesis. So this chapter is called Discussion and Conclusion. Let's focus on the items for this chapter 5. Basically, you have 7 items: introduction, summary of finding, discussion of finding, and all the way to the conclusion of the study. Now, you can separate the summary from discussion. You can also embed the summary of finding in the discussion of finding if you want. All right, so you have an option, but I would suggest that you split them up so that you have specific summary of findings from your research question 1, 2, and 3. And let's go into the detail of this. Number 1, you present summary of finding for research question 1, 2, and 3, and this you would take from chapter 4. Don't copy and paste exactly word by words, from chapter 4 and put into chapter 5 because you're going to have problem with the Terminate software later on. So what you do is that you reword the sentences and then put them together, reorganize them and put into chapter 5. And then you discuss each finding separately for research question 1, 2, and 3. So when you try to relate the finding, you relate to the theories, you relate to the concept you talk about in chapter 1 and 2, and also you talk about the selected past studies in chapter 2. How do you relate? How do you show the meaning or how relevant your findings are today with the past studies? But do not do any new literature review in chapter 5. Simply provide citation, show relationship between your study, your finding with the findings in the past. Then we move to implication of the study. Implication of study requires you to talk about who benefit the studies, who benefit the finding. Probably administrators, policymakers, okay, ministries and teachers and students, consumers, public concern. You had one section in chapter 1 called significance of the study when you prepared the proposal. You can take a look at those significant study and reorganize, rewrite them and put into the implication in terms of specific group of people who would benefit from the study. Then you move to the next one called limitation. In chapter 1, remember, you talk about scope of the study. You don't mention limitation of study in chapter 1 because you haven't carried out your research, and how would you know there are limitations? So therefore, you talk about scope of the study in chapter 1, but after you carry out your research, you found that certain things you cannot carry out. For example, COVID-19. Okay, because of the COVID pandemic, you could not carry out the things that you plan to do. Therefore, you change. So this is called constraint. So then you talk about the limitation in chapter 5. And finally, you talk about recommendation for future research. Perhaps in your research, you have not covered everything. So you mentioned what has not been covered. Perhaps that can be a good issue for future studies. What can or should be done in the future to continue this study? So these are the things that probably you can recommend in this section. Don't include implication in recommendation because you have the implication section separately. All right. And finally, you do the conclusion of the study. This section is not about conclusion of the chapter, not a summary of chapter, but you put the conclusive remark about everything about your study. If you need help, you can go for some software that can be very helpful to proofread your thesis. And then there's some grammar, perhaps program, ChatGPT and whatnot. So, but of course, you can also ask services. Ask for services that are provided by many individuals. You can look into the internet. And now, if you do self-proofreading of your thesis, make sure you proofread many times. Okay, sometimes the author does not realize, simple mistake, common mistake that the person has made. Okay, so all the best with your thesis, all the best with your writing. And if you have any question, please write down, in this video. section and in the remarks. And also you can send email to me. Thank you. Take care.